Hey, today I'm going to do a video about moving from one campaign to another, basically how to wrap up a game and start a session zero for your next game. Second campaign tips. I just finished up my Tomb of Annihilation campaign, and I am lucky enough to have a bunch of players who want to keep going and start a second campaign with me. This is awesome, but it does pose the challenge of what do I carry over from my previous campaign into my next campaign, and what do I want to try and do differently. I realized that there was a major kind of cultural moment in D&D that happened a couple years back when Critical Role had this. They finished up a 1 through 20 level campaign. The interesting part here is that I didn't watch this, so I'm learning this just kind of on my own. I did not use Critical Role. I get that there's a lot of parallels here to Critical Role, but they're lost on me, so apologize for that. So what I'm going to cover, I'm going to cover ending a campaign real quick, and then getting real post-campaign feedback and some tips that I've learned to get players who normally don't want to speak out at a table about what they like and what they don't like, getting them to open up a little bit because their input will be important to making the next game fun. Also wanted to get into how I pitched and let my players vote for the next campaign, and how when we started out we did a session zero and some of the big questions that I asked to make sure that the next game we did was as fun as it could be. And lastly, I'm going to get into how we loaded up some of our homebrew ideas into D&D Beyond so that we could use them in a virtual tabletop tool seamlessly. All right, so first thing to do when finishing a campaign is make sure that it's actually finished. Players often want to keep talking about their characters for a bit and what they would do after the end of the final adventure, so let them. So instead of jumping straight from the grand finale of Tomb of Annihilation into session zero of the next game, we had an in-between game. We called it the Epilogue game. So this game took place after the final fight, but before we said goodbye to the characters, or at least put them on the shelf for now. So this is very similar to the end of a movie or the end of a book where you have a little epilogue. It's an extra chapter where you talk about, maybe in a slightly different voice or a slightly different pace of narration, what happens to the characters afterwards. So classic example is Animal House or American Graffiti, or one of these movies where the people in high school or in college, you get a little montage of what they do after the story's over. So I made sure that this happened in story mode. There are a couple of rooms of Tomb of Annihilation that could kill you after the final boss, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't have an anticlimactic end, having a character maybe lose their last handful of hit points on something dumb after achieving this great victory over the Tomb of Annihilation. So I say it happens in story mode, which means nothing happens that the players don't want to happen that would spoil their fun or create an anticlimactic end. Sometimes, and this actually came up in my game, some of the players will have different thoughts about resurrection than other players. So we had one character death in our Tomb of Annihilation finale, and it was actually disintegration, so resurrection a little tougher. And one of the surviving PCs collected up the ashes of the fallen character and decided, we're going to take this back to town and see if we can get it resurrected. And you could see from the look on the player's face that maybe that's not something they'd thought of. Maybe they'd had a week now to say goodbye to the character. The campaign's over. My tip is just to always make sure that resurrecting a character is the character's choice and not something that's forced upon them. Even if you're continuing the campaign, they may be ready for a next character. They may be done playing that one and find that death a suiting end for an adventurer. So you might just think about it, talk about it in the open. Because some characters want it doesn't mean that everybody wants it. And then give people a chance to get some closure with their characters. So we gave people a week to think about, what does this character do after the Tomb of Annihilation? Some people went back home. Other people were restless and felt like the quest was not done, and they went after some of the remaining bad guys. Other people, they had a huge amount of money from the Tomb of Annihilation, decided what they were going to go invest that in. I think somebody bought a pirate ship. So the story goes on, but you kind of do it in like the end of Game of Thrones, like what do they do, where do they end up, quick montage in story mode. So after that's closed up, everyone's got closure, the story's over. They're no longer talking about their characters, they're talking about the whole campaign. Prep people and give them some warning that in the second half of this epilogue game, you're going to ask for a discussion about the previous game. And the reason for the discussion is not necessarily a complaint session. The reason is so that they can help you, because you let them know that you're asking for this to help. You're asking for this because you have a desire to change things up, to try some new things, to test your DM skills in a different direction. And you wanted to make sure that those directions were, also compatible with the characters and the players and what they want out of the next game. So let them know that you're asking for feedback, not just as criticism, but as something that's going to help improve the next game and keep it fun. So let them know to think about it for the week ahead of time. But then when they come, some of them will have lots of stuff, but ask open-ended questions. And by this, I mean, don't just ask a bunch of yes-no questions. Ask questions that invite the players to start talking. Your goal is to ask an open-ended question and then shut up, right? Your goal is to get them talking. So yes-no questions tend to have very short answers, whereas an open-ended question can really help draw out the conversation at the table. So you should be asking who, what, where, why, when, how questions, not yes-no questions. And then once you get them started talking, get them to keep talking, because oftentimes it's the second or third thing they'll say when they start, riffing off of each other about what they love from the scene or what they love from a mechanic or an element of the story. So there's a couple tips here. When someone says something, you can use this technique called mirroring, where if they say a word and there's a key word in what they said, don't repeat the whole thing or ask a complex question digging in. Just repeat one word of what they said. So they say, well, some of the combat mechanics were kind of frustrating, but it was fine. Your response shouldn't just be, hey, can you please criticize me some more? I'd like to know more about that. You should instead say frustrating, and literally cock your head to the right, just repeat that one word, frustrating, and leave some blank space afterwards. And man, people like to talk. They will fill it in. Right? And this is a sort of technique for getting people to doing some discovering, getting people to open up about what's actually going on. They're maybe a little hesitant to actually tell you how they really feel. So let them feel welcome, giving that feedback by doing some mirroring. Also, just a favorite statement I make is when someone asks, says a criticism or a bit of feedback, they haven't always fully processed everything about it. Sometimes it'll take them a couple of tries to explain what they really mean. So if they say something, even if you think you've got it, ask them, hey, could you unpack that for me? Can you just, I get that you've given it to me in this package that's nice and small, but can you unpack it for me a little bit and just help me understand that a little bit more? And sometimes it's on the second reiteration of what they're saying to you that you'll really understand it. So take notes. By taking notes, the players know you're listening, and they'll actually put the effort into telling you stuff because they think something's going to happen as a result of it. But realize that as the DM, you don't have to do all of it, right? You're getting feedback, you're getting thoughts, and then this is going to influence the next part of the game. You're not a short order cook figuring out how their breakfast is going to get made. That's not your role as a DM. Your role is to make a story that all works together and take some input, but also has some input from you as well about the game that you want to run. So my players did this, and this is kind of what they told me. They told me that they, in Tomb of Annihilation, loved the open world play style. We spent the last 20 weeks or so in a big mega dungeon, and it was fun. They'd never done that before, and at least not with me. They really enjoyed it, but one thing that they realized is that that's not something they wanted to do all the time. Shorter dungeons, open world exploration, that's really the part of the campaign they liked the most and wanted to happen again. They did not want to get thrown into another big mega dungeon for quite a while. Okay. When we talked about their characters, the part that they liked the most about the characters was not the writing of the backstory, or even necessarily some of the mechanics of, you got a curse put on you or something, but it was the organic character development. And by this, an example was there was a wizard, started at first level and got beat up pretty bad by some velociraptors, and decided at that moment that they didn't want to die. and they were going to become a abjurer to protect themselves in this dangerous world. So that was sort of an in-game decision that they made. So organic character development. I had a bunch of characters in this game that didn't start with a plan, but sort of discovered that plan based upon the encounters and the influences of the world. And they really enjoyed that. So, okay, we're going to maybe do that. Make sure that our characters are archetypes that can come into the world and encounter things and then have that mold their character as opposed to being one fixed thing for the whole campaign. One comment that came out is people wanted to have a character that had a little bit more of a place in the world. So in my Tomb of Annihilation game, they were all outsiders. None of them came from this island of Chult. They all came from outside. And as a result, they had these backstories, but they never really came up, right? None of the organizations or the characters or things that they imagined their character doing came up in the game because their characters weren't super connected to the world. They were from outside the setting. So we decided, okay, great. Whatever we do, we're going to have the characters be from this setting. I've played a couple of different types of games with these folks, and they read, and they're on Reddit, and they follow a little bit of role-playing game, YouTube and such. And one thing that they really liked was this concept that they asked for more of, which was they like that the map has spaces in between. They like the points of light setting that Chult did so well. And they wanted this concept from Dungeon World, which is a really good game you should read. It says, draw a rough map, but leave spaces for extra things to come up during game so that during the game you can fill in details in the map that maybe weren't there when you drew the map to begin with. They really like that concept, so we'll bring it into the next game. And the last thing is they wanted to find a way to relax the combat mechanics of D&D 5th edition. So several people had martial characters, and they were getting a little bored. They realized that their best damage output and damage soaking came when they were just doing really simple attacks. By the end, the barbarian was getting 3 swings with their sword. That was doing a lot of damage, and it was really a threat that the monsters had to deal with. And the player realized that if he didn't do that, if he tried to do something more creative, push over the wheelbarrow to trip somebody, that just wasn't as effective in the combat against the monsters as just swinging the sword. So they wanted some way for choices to be creative but not suboptimal for the fight. Also, they felt that when they got inspiration and they used it, it didn't have as big of a payoff as they were hoping for. So they wanted me to mess with the inspiration system slightly or suggest some alternatives. So I'm not sure I found solutions to all of these, but I took all of this and I sat on it and I thought, okay, the next game we play, I want to hit as many of these as possible. I repeated back, hey, this is what you said. I'm going to try and come up with a couple of pitches to think about the next game we want to play. And this is important. If people start shouting at you, I want to run this, I want to run this, I want to run this, that's interesting. Take those into account. But realize that at the end of the day, you're the DM and you're going to have to do a lot of prep, likely. And unless one of those just sounds perfect, you are going to need to now take this open feedback session and direct it back onto the lines of, and these are the options. So the way I do this is I give them 3 pitches, so they still have choice, but all 3 of the pitches are custom tailored to hit the mark. They're not in totally orthogonal different directions. Each of them is based on something that I think would actually work. They match the intended play style that we talked about in this epilogue game. They match the constraints of, whatever, in-person, online, whatever the time of the amount of prep, the amount of time between games, how long the games are. They match the style of the constraints that we're going to have. And they're also something that I will be personally excited to run. It's a campaign, so for months and months, possibly years. And then presented with these 3 pitches and a little bit of background around the story, a little bit of flavor text, a little bit of ideas for these are the types of races and classes that would be appropriate. These are the major powers and threats of the world, the types of conflict that you'll be getting into. I have the players do a vote. But there's more than one way to vote. There's more than just, pick your top favorite, because then you might find that you have a totally split decision that doesn't actually reflect what the characters are interested in playing. if everyone's just voting for one of these 3 pitches, that's not going to work, especially when there's a very small number of voters. So we're going to have a vote, but we're not going to do it just to establish who's in first place. Let me show you how I do that vote. So I send out a Google form, with just a simple picture. They got to go read the email to get the full description. But then for each item, for each over the 3 pitches, I have like a 1 to 5 scale, where a 3 is somewhere in the middle of neutral. 1 is not interested, 5 is very interested, right? And this helps you gauge, what's the shape of people's desire to play these games. If you could have one person very interested and everybody else is somewhat neutral or less than interested, and it could win the numerical vote potentially, but you could see, hey, that's actually not the best one because most people aren't into it. I'm now just running the story for one person. So we did it for 3 pitches, and we got some interesting things. One, I know my players pretty well, and I wrote enough flavor text so they all sounded somewhat interesting. But we got a very different result for each of the 3 pitches. So you see for the first one here, which was the Sword Coast, we got a thin spread, 1 vote each, all across the spectrum. And down here for Eberron, we had 2 people were neutral, and then 2 people were better than neutral. And then for this Inner Sea Homebrew campaign that I pitched, we had everybody above neutral. So this is the only one where everyone was more than just neutral and positive on the idea. So that's the one we picked. So the next game I'm running is sort of an underwater campaign with a custom pitch, sort of Atlantis, themed game that's got pirates and underwater nations and, spooky Cthulhu things in the deep trenches potentially. We'll figure it out. It's homebrew. We don't know everything that's in it. We're just going to figure that out by playing the game. So next, that gave me a very short period of time to get ready for session 0 because we run weekly here for 2 hours. So the goal for the session 0 is to get people to flesh out the world with me a little bit, but do it with the party in mind. I'll make the world, but the players need to really have a stake in what the party is and what the party is doing. So I remind them what the world is about, but then I want them to come up with what is the adventuring party's role in the world. We're doing party first, story hook second. So what is your adventuring party's role in the world? Now, if I was running a campaign like a module, like a book, I might do story hooks first, party second, but I'm doing the reverse since it's a totally homebrew world because they said they wanted open world exploration and organic character development. So what is your adventuring party's role in the world? Is that common? Why did your party come together? Why did they actually stay together? These are questions that they think about. Maybe they all come to session 0 with some character concepts. You can't stop them from doing a little bit of character creation before session 0. But now you try and get them to discuss first, why did this group come together? They decided they all signed on to a pirate ship. They all wanted to see the world. They became friends on the pirate ship as crew members, and they'll do the first lower level adventures as crew people of this pirate ship that they are not the captain of. Great, that's lots of stuff for me to go with. I got a captain NPC, got a way of getting around and seeing the world and moving between different islands, and they all maybe have a different role on the boat. Maybe one's the navigator, another one's the muscle. Like lots of stuff can happen there. And then they started fleshing out their characters, and we did a little review of the house rules from the previous game and which ones we wanted to carry over, and the logistics, what night of the week we're meeting, does anything need to change? And we had one person drop out. We had one person whose life got very busy and just thought this was a good time to bow out, and and totally cool. They're welcome back whenever. That starts my big week of prep. The week between session 0 and session 1 for a virtual tabletop GM is a very busy week. My prep week tools that I came to rely on were, for making tokens, I draw them with my iPad in a program called Procreate, which is pretty cheap. And then I migrate them over to Photoshop, which unfortunately is not pretty cheap. And I do some of the compositing and final layout of the tokens and sizing and transparency and things like that there. I bake the final token PNG file in Photoshop. For maps, since you said open world, I wanted to make sure that whatever happens in the game, I'll be able to update and rapidly create new maps as fast as possible. So In the background, I've been learning this program called Incarnate. It's a web app. I'll show it. I'll probably do a video on it later. So I make a basic layout in Incarnate, and then I doctor it up in Photoshop a bunch to get it ready for the game, knowing that I'll be able to recreate all of that very quickly if I ever need to add something to the map. So I tested that and I made sure it worked. For world building, I had to make sure that I had something that was, like a wiki, right? Something I can add to really quickly that the players can see to establish if it happens in game, it's canon, and then another area to keep my notes and ideas, and maybe to make sure that if a player shouted out an idea, but it wasn't ready to come up in the game yet, that I saved it somewhere other than my email. I took a recommendation from another Foundry VTT YouTuber named Encounter Library. Checked out Legend Keeper, it's pretty awesome. You should check it out too. And then because we're running in a homebrew setting and everyone was talking about these races that weren't in the player's handbook, I realized I'm gonna have to make homebrew work in D&D Beyond because we use D&D Beyond so heavily. So for that, I had to go and make sure that was working, and it actually works pretty smoothly. I'm gonna do videos on a bunch of that stuff later, but let's really quickly go through how homebrew races work in D&D Beyond. So really quickly, let's go through how homebrew races work in D&D Beyond. So you go into the main menu and there's this area called My Homebrew Creations. You hit Create New and you click on the Create New Homebrew Race and it brings up a menu and you have this ability to create sub-races and variants. I'm not really messing with that because I'm creating whole new races. So you create a new race and it gives you this really useful thing, and I do recommend you use this just to learn how races are built. You might make just a couple copies of things like an elf and a dwarf just to learn all the various ways to add proficiencies. So just create a couple of clones of existing races, and then for the one that you're trying to make, pick a race that's somewhat similar to it or as close as possible, and it'll have a lot of stuff filled out for you already. So I'm making an Atlantean, which is really similar but not quite the same as a Triton from, I think it's Volo's Guide, one of the books, whatever. So you make it and then you change the name and you start tweaking it. So I went from Triton to Atlantean, and you'll see that I add in parentheses afterwards the name of the campaign setting, because if ever I need to run multiple homebrew campaigns at the same time or keep an old one around, I might need to distinguish for the rules between one table and another, and since there's no way to sort of turn on and off homebrew per campaign, make it clear which campaign this homebrew is for, so people don't think all the homebrew I have loaded is for maybe a different game or a one-shot or something. So Atlantean Inner Sea is the name of my campaign here. So once you start going into here, you can create the different racial traits. A lot of these are from Triton, but other ones I had to modify. So a Triton gets air and water spells, and I wanted to switch it so Atlanteans just have air spells. So I switched up Wall of Water to Wind Wall to signify slightly a different reskinning of that character's powers. Now when the players go and create their characters, all they have to do is turn on the homebrew content in D&D Beyond, and then all of the options, if they filter by homebrew, all the options that I created for this game show up. And now they can create a character and import those characters into Foundry VTT, or however you end up moving your rolls over, or printing them out and rolling the physical dice. However you do it, you should be ready to go if your players know how to use D&D Beyond. From that point out, everything should be the same, unless they spot something that they didn't like or they want you to change. And then you just have to go and change the character's race, and eventually that'll propagate to their character sheet. So I take the full kind of HTML version of the character class, or the character race from D&D Beyond, and I paste it into my wiki, which worked quite well. And I leave a little link to its homebrew link at the top, and now we're good to go. So now the players can browse in our little wiki all the different character races that we made during character creation, and a couple of ideas I had, though maybe I haven't filled out all of these in homebrew, just the ones that I needed to for game one. And now we're all set. Made tokens, characters are loaded, we're getting close to game one, and I'm really, really excited. So in terms of characters for my game, we have an Atlantean cleric, a sort of ghost pirate rogue fighter. We have what's called a Nidarian, so it's like a jellyfish person who is a monk, and we've got a frog person artificer. So party of 4, about to go and explore the underwater oceans and the pirates on the surface level and all kinds of fun stuff there. That was how I moved from the end of my Tomb of Annihilation game to my next game, and some of the process I went into to getting the players both invested and excited and ready to transition and start this new game. So next time, I'm going to show you my Foundry VTT setup for this new game, but I'm going to do it time delayed because I don't want there to be spoilers for my group. So I'm going to record a bunch of videos, but I'm going to let them kind of hit the YouTube weeks later. So you're going to be seeing stuff pretty time delayed from when I actually recorded it, but that prevents spoilers, which is awesome. I'm going to go through some more advanced Foundry modules. So the next ones I'm going to cover are Combat Utility Belt and Token Magic, with regards to some of the things I did for my game one, stuff that I did to help people realize just how cool Foundry can be and automate some stuff so that some of the annoying things I had to do in my previous virtual tabletop, I don't have to do. And I'm going to get into Incarnate a bit. I've gotten pretty good at rapidly prototyping maps at the level of quality I want to get for my game. Not super high quality, not necessarily the stuff you see in the art boards, but just good enough and readable for the players to play the game. I'm going to get into making exploration-oriented maps in Incarnate. So if this is interesting to you, subscribe to the channel, and I'll be getting these up. All right, thanks everybody.